If you enjoy tales spun from the restless corners of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories to fill your sleepless nights. Tonight's chapter is the first in our series, The Long Dark of the Norse, where we delve into the brutal, restless nights of Viking life, where the sun's absence stretched longer than a winter's shadow and sleep was as elusive as a calm sea. The wind howled through the longhouse like a spirit denied entry to Valhalla. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland, the kind of cold that gnawed at bones and made even the hardiest of men question their life choices. Inside, the fire spat and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Shadows that seemed to move just a little too independently for comfort. This was the season of endless night, when the sun barely graced the sky, and darkness clung to the land like a jealous lover. For Thorgrim, the wide sleep was a fickle beast. He lay on his back atop a pile of furs, staring at the smoke-blackened rafters, counting the same 3 cracks in the wood for what felt like the 100th time. Beside him, his wife, Helga, snored with the vigor of a bear in mid-hibernation. Across the hall, his brother-in-law, Bjorn the surprisingly literate, muttered in his sleep about tax reforms, of all things. Thorgrim sighed. The night stretched before him, vast and unyielding. He had tried every remedy known to Viking kind. Mead, of course, had been the first attempt, a generous horn's worth, enough to make a lesser man forget his own name. But Thorgrim's constitution was iron, and all it had done was make him need to piss twice as often. Then there was the warm milk, boiled with a pinch of ground elk antler, a trick his grandmother swore by. The result? A stomachache and a lingering suspicion that grandmother had been making things up. The real problem, Thorgrim decided, was the silence. Not true silence, of course. There was always the wind, the occasional creak of timber, the distant howl of wolves. No, it was the absence of battle. The lack of axes meeting shields, of war cries splitting the air. His body, conditioned by years of raids and brawls, refused to settle without the familiar clamor of violence. It was as if his very bones missed the chaos. So Thorgrim did what any sensible, sleep-deprived Viking would do. He grabbed his axe. Not for violence, though the thought did cross his mind, but for rhythm. He stepped outside, the cold biting at his cheeks, and began to chop wood. The steady thunk of steel biting into oak was soothing in its own way. Each swing was methodical, a meditation in destruction. The pile grew, and with it a strange sense of calm. By the time the first pale hints of dawn crept over the horizon, Thorgrim's arms ached, his breath came in white puffs, and the longhouse was stocked with enough firewood to last a week. But more importantly, his mind was quiet. He returned to his furs, axe still in hand, and closed his eyes. Sleep, when it finally came, was dreamless and deep. And so it went in the long dark of the north. While Skalds and Skalds might romanticize the Viking spirit, the truth was far simpler. Sometimes the only way to quiet a restless mind was to give it exactly what it craved. A task, a purpose, and if all else failed, an axe and something to hit with it. The next night, of course, Thorgrim would be wide awake again. But that was a problem for future Thorgrim. Present Thorgrim had a pile of firewood to admire, and, at long last, a few precious hours of peace. Chapter 2. Pillows of Plunder. Helga had finally had enough. Thorgrim's tossing and turning had reached legendary proportions, so much so that she had considered smothering him with his own cloak just to get some peace. But she was a practical woman, and murdering one's husband, however tempting, was generally frowned upon, even in Viking society. Instead, she devised a different solution. One morning, after another night of Thorgrim's ceaseless fidgeting, she dragged a sack into the longhouse and dumped its contents onto the floor with a clatter. Thorgrim, bleary-eyed from yet another sleepless night, squinted at the pile. It was an assortment of objects, some familiar, some less so. A dented Frankish goblet, a tattered Saxon cloak, a small wooden figurine that might have been a saint, or possibly just a badly carved horse. "What is this?" Thorgrim asked, poking at the figurine with the tip of his knife. "Your new pillow," Helga said, folding her arms. Thorgrim frowned. "It's a pile of stolen junk." "Exactly," Helga said. "And every time you roll onto it in the night, it will remind you that comfort is for the weak." This, it turned out, was the Viking solution to insomnia. If you couldn't sleep, you might as well stay sharp. Pillows in the traditional sense. Soft, plush, inviting were viewed with suspicion. A man who slept too soundly was a man who could be ambushed in his own bed. Better to rest atop the spoils of battle, where every lump and jagged edge served as a reminder that the world was harsh, and a warrior must always be ready. Thorgrim, skeptical but desperate, arranged the items into a rough nest that night. He lay down, wincing as a brooch dug into his shoulder. The Frankish goblet, placed just so beneath his head, had an unfortunate tendency to rock sideways whenever he shifted, sending him jerking awake. The Saxon cloak smelled faintly of damp and defeat. And yet, something strange happened. The discomfort, rather than keeping him awake, became a kind of rhythm. Each twinge of pain, each sudden jab from an errant trinket, pulled him back from the edge of dreams just enough to prevent the yawning abyss of full wakefulness. He hovered in that twilight state, never quite asleep but never fully conscious, his body attuned to every shift and creak of the night. By the third night he had perfected the arrangement. The figurine went under his lower back, ensuring he couldn't sprawl too comfortably. The goblet was positioned to tilt just enough to startle him without actually spilling. The cloak, now somewhat flattened, provided just enough padding to keep the brooch from drawing blood. It was, in its own way, a masterpiece of engineering. Bjorn, the surprisingly literate, observing this ritual with scholarly interest, remarked that it was a fascinating psychological adaptation. "You've essentially trained yourself to sleep in a state of controlled suffering," he said. Thorgrim grunted. "I call it victory rest." Helga, satisfied, returned to her own pile of furs, which, it should be noted, were suspiciously soft and free of pillaged artifacts. The system worked, at least for a time. But as with all things in Viking life, peace was fleeting. One night, Thorgrim woke to the sound of something skittering across the floor. He lay still, listening. The noise came again, a faint, metallic scraping. His hand closed around the axe at his side. The thief, a scrawny lad from a neighboring village, had made the mistake of thinking the longhouse would be an easy target. He had not accounted for Thorgrim's new sleeping arrangement, specifically the fact that the pile of stolen goods was now booby-trapped. As the boy reached for the Frankish goblet, his foot caught on a loop of fishing wire Thorgrim had rigged to a precariously balanced shield. The resulting crash was spectacular. Thorgrim was on his feet before the shield hit the ground. The boy, wide-eyed, froze like a hare in torchlight. For a long moment, the two stared at each other. Then Thorgrim sighed. "If you're going to steal," he said, "at least have the decency to do it in daylight like an honest man." He tossed the boy a slightly less dented cup from the pile. "Now get out. I finally figured out how to sleep." The boy fled. Thorgrim lay back down, adjusting the goblet beneath his head. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted. The wind rattled the shutters. And for the first time in weeks, Thorgrim the Wide slept through the night. Chapter 3. The Ballad of the Midnight Axe. Winter had tightened its grip on the settlement, turning the air into something sharp enough to shave with. The nights stretched so long that even the wolves seemed bored with their own howling. Thorgrim, now the proud owner of a semi-functional sleep system involving stolen goods and strategic discomfort, had begun to notice a new problem. His axe was dull. This would not do. A dull axe was a personal insult to any self-respecting Viking, a sign of sloth, poor planning, or worst of all, adomesticity. Thorgrim had once known a man who let his blade go blunt, and the shame had been so unbearable that the poor fellow had voluntarily joined a monastery just to escape the sideways glances. Thorgrim would not suffer such a fate. But therein lay the dilemma. When was there time to sharpen it? The days were already filled with the usual necessities: chopping wood, arguing about whose turn it was to feed the goats, drinking just enough mead to maintain social standing without actually impairing one's ability to walk in a straight line. No, the only available hours were the cursed endless ones between midnight and dawn, when the world was too dark to do anything useful and yet too restless to sleep. And so began Thorgrim's new ritual: midnight axe polishing. The first night he had simply sat by the hearth, running a whetstone along the edge of his beloved weapon, the rhythmic ing-scree-scra of metal on stone filling the longhouse. It was, he had to admit, a soothing sound, almost musical. Helga, who had been mid-snore, cracked one eye open. "What in Odin's name are you doing?" "Maintaining my edge," Thorgrim said without pausing. Helga stared at him, then at the axe, then back at him. "It's the middle of the night." "So?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then yanked a fur over her head with a grunt. The second night, Bjorn the surprisingly literate joined him, not out of any particular love for weapon maintenance, but because he claimed the sound helped him organize his thoughts. He sat cross-legged beside Thorgrim, scribbling notes on a scrap of parchment by firelight while Thorgrim worked. "You know," Bjorn mused, "this could be considered a form of meditation." Thorgrim snorted. "It's axe sharpening." "Yes, but think about it. The repetitive motion, the focus, the way your mind empties of everything but the task at hand. It's practically spiritual." Thorgrim squinted at him. "Are you suggesting I'm praying to my axe?" Bjorn shrugged. "I'm just saying, if the gods can hear prayers whispered over a candle, why not over a whetstone?" This was admittedly a troubling thought. Thorgrim had never considered himself a particularly devout man. He attended the occasional sacrifice, threw a coin or two into a sacred spring when convenient, but he had certainly never worshipped a tool. Still, there was something undeniably satisfying about the way the blade gleamed in the firelight when he was done, sharp enough to split a hair dropped from his own beard. By the third night, others had joined. It started with young Rold, who couldn't sleep because he'd eaten too much smoked fish and was now haunted by digestive regrets. Then came Asger the slightly cross-eyed, who claimed the sound drowned out the voices in his head, though he refused to specify whose voices they were. Before long, nearly half the men of the settlement were gathered around the hearth in the dead of night, whetstones in hand, axes across their laps, all scraping away in eerie unison. Helga, who had given up on sleep entirely, now sat at the far end of the longhouse with the other women, playing a tense game of Nefatafel and occasionally glaring in the men's direction. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. Astrid, who had once stabbed a man for snoring too loudly, nodded in agreement. "We should throw them all outside." Gudrun, the eldest, sighed. "Let them have this. It's either this or they start wrestling again, and I'm tired of stitching them up." The midnight sharpening sessions became something of a legend. Visitors from other villages would arrive, hear the tales, and ask to witness the spectacle. Some even brought their own axes, eager to participate in what was now being called the Ballad of the Night Axe, though no one could quite explain why it was a ballad when no singing was involved. Thorgrim, for his part, found that he slept better than ever, not because the axe polishing tired him out, but because it gave his restless hands something to do. There was a peace in the ritual, a certainty. A sharp axe was a dependable thing. It didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't question why it was being woken at such an ungodly hour. It simply was gone. And if, in the process, he happened to convert a few more souls to the midnight sharpening cult, well, that was just a bonus. One particularly cold night, as the wind screamed outside like a banshee with a grudge, Thorgrim sat back and admired his handiwork. The axe's edge caught the firelight, throwing tiny sparks onto the packed dirt floor. Bjorn, ever the philosopher, leaned over. "Do you think this is what happiness feels like?" Thorgrim thought about it. "No," he said finally, "but it's close enough." And with that, he lay down on his pile of stolen treasures, axe within easy reach, and closed his eyes. Outside, the wolves howled. Inside, the whetstones sang. And somewhere in between, Thorgrim the Wide finally, blessedly, slept. Chapter 4. Freyja's Insomniac Blessing. Even gods, it turned out, had trouble sleeping. This revelation came to Thorgrim during one of Bjorn the Surprisingly Literate's late-night lectures, delivered between axe sharpenings as the fire spat embers onto the packed earth floor. Bjorn had been deep into his cups, not enough to slur, but enough to wax poetic about the cosmic struggles of deities. "Take Odin," Bjorn said, gesturing with a half-eaten leg of smoked mutton. "The Owl-Father himself once sacrificed an eye for wisdom, then hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights, just to learn the secrets of the runes. Do you think a man like that sleeps well? I imagine he lies awake, staring at the ceiling of Valhalla, wondering if it was all worth." Thorgrim grunted, running a thumb along his axe blade. "Sounds familiar." "But the real insomniac of the gods," Bjorn continued, ignoring the interruption, "is Freyja." This got Thorgrim's attention. Freyja, goddess of love, fertility, and, more importantly, war and death, was not someone to dismiss lightly. If anyone understood restlessness, it would be her. Bjorn leaned in, lowering his voice. "They say she wanders the night, clad in her falcon cloak, searching for her missing husband, Ogre. Some versions claim he abandoned her. Others say he's lost, doomed to roam until Ragnarok. Either way, she never rests, and when she passes over mortal homes, her presence stirs the sleepers within." Thorgrim frowned. "So you're saying my insomnia might be divine?" Bjorn shrugged. "Could be, or you could just have bad luck. But if it was Freyja's doing, there's a tradition for that." The tradition, as it turned out, was storytelling. Not just any stories, specific ones whispered into the dark like offerings. Tales of Freyja's cunning, her ferocity, her unending search. The idea was simple. If the goddess was keeping you awake, you might as well give her something to listen to. Maybe then she'd move on. That night, Thorgrim lay on his back, staring at the rafters, and decided to test the theory. "All right, Freyja," he muttered. "Let's see if this works." He began with the story of how she tricked 4 dwarves out of the Brisingamen necklace by sleeping with each of them. Not because he particularly cared for jewelry-related gossip, but because the tale had enough twists to keep even a goddess entertained. By the time he got to the part where Loki, in the form of a flea, bit Freyja's cheek to steal the necklace back, Thorgrim's voice had taken on a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality. Across the hall, Rold sat up. "Are you telling bedtime stories to the sky? Go back to sleep, Rold." "But," answered Mood, "but seriously, Adri, antidanam sasibwanin, kilideu posika." Kasi. Roald lay back down. Thorgrim continued, switching to the tale of Freyja weeping golden tears for her missing husband, tears that turned into amber when they hit the earth. His voice grew slower, softer. Somewhere in the telling he realized he wasn't just reciting a myth, he was negotiating. "Hare," he thought, "have this story. Let me resty." Outside, the wind sighed through the thatch. The fire burned low. And then something shifted. It wasn't a sound, exactly. More like the absence of one. The usual creaks and groans of the longhouse quieted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Even Helga's snoring paused mid-rumble. Thorgrim froze. A whisper of feathers brushed against the edge of his hearing. The scent of crushed meadowsweet, a flower that didn't bloom in winter, drifted through the air. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The longhouse exhaled. The fire crackled back to life. Helga resumed snoring with a noise like a drowning walrus. Thorgrim waited, muscles tense. When nothing else happened, he let out a slow breath and closed his eyes. He wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. He wasn't sure if it mattered. But for the first time in weeks, when sleep came, it came without dreams. The next morning, Bjorn found him outside, staring at the frost-crusted ground near the longhouse door. There, pressed into the ice, were two faint marks. Not footprints, but something closer to talon scratches, as if a great bird had landed there in the night. Bjorn whistled. Looks like someone was listening. Thorgrim rubbed his face. Next time, remind me to just count sheep. But that night, when the restlessness returned, he found himself reaching for another story. This time it was Freyja dividing the slain with Odin, choosing her half of the battlefields dead for her hall, Sessrum near. His voice was barely louder than the rustling of furs, but the words filled the dark like smoke. Somewhere beyond the walls, a falcon cried. And once again, Thorgrim slept. Borg spread. Soon, others in the village began murmuring Freyja's tales into their pillows, trading them like secrets. Old Gudrun told the one about the goddess teaching sayer magic to the Aesir. Astrid favored the story of Freyja riding her boar, Hildisvini, into battle. Even Helga, though she'd never admit it, sometimes whispered the tale of Freyja lending her cloak to Loki so he could fly to Jotunheim. The stories didn't always work. Some nights, the insomnia clung like tar, and no amount of mythology could shake it loose. But on the nights it did work, there was a strange comfort in knowing that even gods knew what it was to lie awake in the dark, waiting for dawn. One evening, as Thorgrim finished recounting how Freyja had once transformed a disrespectful suitor into a mare, he paused. The longhouse was quiet, save for the soft breathing of its occupants. Outside, the northern lights shimmered green and gold, their reflections flickering across the walls like restless spirits. Bjorn, half asleep, mumbled, "Do you think she ever finds him? I mean." Thorgrim watched the lights dance. "Maybe not," he said at last. "But I think she keeps looking anyway." And with that, he closed his eyes, letting the silence settle over him like a cloak. Somewhere high above, beyond the reach of mortal axes or midnight rituals, a falcon circled on unseen currents, its golden eyes scanning the earth below. The night stretched on. But for once, that was all right. Chapter 5. The Sheep That Counted Vikings. There were only so many stories one could tell Freyja before even the goddess grew bored. Thorgrim had reached this conclusion after the 5th consecutive night of recounting her exploits, when his voice had grown hoarse, and the only response from the unseen heavens was what sounded suspiciously like a divine yawn. It was time for a new approach. The problem, as always, was the silence. The longhouse was too quiet, the night too long, and Thorgrim's mind too full of the day's unfinished business, mostly involving axes, grudges, and the persistent question of whether Bjorn actually knew what taxes were, or if he was just making them up to sound important. Then one evening, a traveling Skald arrived with a curious tale. They say the Skald announced between sips of mead that in the far southern lands men count sheep to lull themselves to sleep. The assembled Vikings stared at him. "Counts? Is sheep?" Roat repeated, as if the words were in a foreign tongue. "Yes," the Skald said. They imagine sheep leaping over a fence, one by one, and tally them in their minds until sleep takes them. A heavy silence followed. Then, as one, the Vikings burst into laughter. "Absurd," Thorgrim said, wiping his beard. What warrior would waste time picturing wee sheep when he could be reviewing battle formations? Or planning raids, Azure added. Or remembering enemies left unkilled, Helga muttered, sharpening her knife with unnecessary vigor. The Skald shrugged. I only report what I hear. But the idea, ridiculous as it was, stuck in Thorgrim's mind. That night, as he lay awake yet again, he considered it. Sheep were useless creatures, true, but perhaps there was a kernel of something useful in the concept. If Southerners could count docile livestock, why couldn't a Viking count something more stimulating? And so, with the resigned determination of a man who had tried everything else, Thorgrim closed his eyes and began counting. Not sheep. Need to now. One, he murmured, picturing the red-haired Dane who challenged him at the last gathering. The man had swung wide, leaving his ribs exposed. A single counterblow had ended it. Two. The Saxon merchant who tried to cheat him on a shipment of Frankish steel. A well-placed axe handle to the kneecap had settled that dispute. 3. The unnamed bandit who'd ambushed him on the road last winter. That one had required a bit more creativity, but the ravine had done most of the work. By the time Thorgrim reached 7, he noticed something peculiar. His breathing had slowed. His muscles, usually taut as bowstrings, had begun to unwind. Encouraged, he continued. Kiss. The berserker who'd mistaken him for someone else. A messy affair, that. 9. Ice. The would-be thief from the neighboring village, the one he'd let go with a dented cup and a warning. 10. A snore interrupted him. His own. Thorgrim blinked into the darkness. Had it worked? The next morning, he reported his findings to the others. So, Bjorn said, tapping his chin, instead of counting sheep, you relived your greatest hits. It's not reliving, Thorgrim corrected. It's inventorying. Roald frowned. But what if you haven't killed enough people to fall asleep? Do you start making them up? Thorgrim scoffed. A true Viking doesn't run out of enemies. The concept caught on faster than a thatch roof in a lightning storm. Soon, the entire village had adopted the practice, each warrior tailoring it to their preferences. Helga counted the number of times she'd made men reconsider their life choices. Bjorn, ever the scholar, tallied intellectual victories, arguments won, treaties negotiated, at one time Hind outsmarted a bishop in a game of riddles. Even young Roald, whose list was admittedly short, found solace in recounting the time he'd head-butted a goat and lived to tell the tale. But as with all good things, there were complications. The first problem arose when Aesgar, the slightly cross-eyed, whose memory was questionable at best, began counting the same enemy 3 times. By the time he reached 15, or possibly 5, depending on how one interpreted his slurred recounting, he had worked himself into such a battle frenzy that he'd overturned 2 benches and tried to duel the central support beam of the longhouse. Then there was Gudrun, who took the exercise too literally. I've run out of human enemies, she announced one night. So now I'm counting spiders I've killed. Oh, Melody. And one particularly rude squirrel. The final straw came when Astrid, ever the overachiever, reached 87 before realizing she'd been awake the entire time. This isn't helping, she growled, throwing a dagger into the wall for emphasis. Thorgrim, ever the pragmatist, called a meeting. We need rules, he declared. After much debate, and one minor scuffle involving a fish, the village settled on a modified system. First, only insignificant enemies counted. No spiders, squirrels, or inanimate objects that had looked at you funny. Second, if you couldn't remember the face of the person you'd killed, it didn't count. This eliminated most of Azure's list. Third, and most importantly, if you reached 20 and were still awake, You were legally required to get up and chop wood until exhaustion took you. The new system worked surprisingly well. Most nights, Thorgrim barely made it past 12 before drifting off. The rhythm of remembering, the weight of the axe, the crunch of snow underfoot, the way the light caught the fear in a man's eyes, was as steady as a lullaby. And if, on particularly restless nights, his count crept higher than usual, well, there was always tomorrow's list to start compiling. One evening, as the village settled into their respective counts, Bjorn sidled up to Thorgrim. "You realize," he said, "that this is just meditation with more bloodshed." Thorgrim shrugged. "If it works, it works." Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled. And one by one the Vikings of the Longhouse drifted off to sleep, their dreams filled with the comforting certainty of enemies properly dispatched. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleated. No one paid it any mind. Chapter 6. Berserker's Midnight Rage. The night before battle was always the worst. Thorgrim lay motionless on his furs, listening to the quiet symphony of the Longhouse. Bjorn's scholarly mumbling, Rold's anxious fidgeting, the occasional wet snort from Azure that suggested he was somehow asleep with his eyes open. Outside, the wind carried whispers of tomorrow's bloodshed. Normally, Thorgrim could sleep through anything, blizzards, bardic recitals, even Helga's legendary snoring. But tonight his body thrummed with restless energy, like a bowstring pulled too tight. He wasn't alone. Across the hall, Ulf the Unwashed was methodically chewing on his own shield rim, a nervous habit that had left every one of his shields, looking like beavers, had courted them. 2 benches over, young Gunnar was flexing his hands open, and closed so vigorously his joints popped like roasting nuts. Even Helga, normally the picture of pre-battle calm, was sharpening the same knife for the 3rd time. The realization struck Thorgrim like an axe handle to the temple. Insomnia wasn't their enemy. It was their ally. This revelation came with perfect timing, as dawn would bring their long-awaited confrontation with Jarl Sigurd's warband, a group whose reputation for cruelty was only slightly less concerning than their reputation for poor hygiene. They needed every advantage they could get. Thorgrim sat up abruptly. "We're doing this wrong." Bjorn blinked owlishly at him. "Doing what wrong?" "Not sleeping," Thorgrim said. "We're treating it like a problem when it's actually—" He searched for the right word. "A weapon," Helga finished, her knife pausing mid-stroke. "Exactly." The concept wasn't entirely new. Everyone knew berserkers fought in frenzied states, though popular opinion differed on whether this came from mushrooms, madness, or particularly bad mead. But Thorgrim wasn't suggesting they choose strange routes or bite their shields. Ulf was already handling that last part. No, this was simpler. They would harness their sleeplessness, let it simmer through the night, and unleash it with the dawn. A slow grin spread across Bjorn's face. Sleep deprivation as battle preparation. It's brilliant in its simplicity. It's also miserable, Rold pointed out. Thorgrim clapped him on the shoulder. That's the spirit. And so began the most intentionally restless night of their lives. They started with physical preparation. Not the usual pre-battle rituals of checking armor or honing weapons. Those had been done to death. But exercises designed to keep the blood moving and the mind sharp. Thorgrim demonstrated what he called the Midnight Axe Dance, a series of slow, controlled movements designed to maintain muscle warmth without expending too much energy. Gunnar and Asger immediately turned it into a competition, which ended when Asger accidentally put his fist through a barrel of pickled herring. Mental stimulation proved trickier. Bjorn suggested philosophical debates. If a tree falls in Valhalla, does it make a sound? But this only succeeded in putting half the warriors to sleep. Helga had better luck with what she called strategic grievance recall, a fancy term for everyone taking turns complaining about Jarl Sigurd's many shortcomings, from his cowardly tactics to his atrocious beard hygiene. By midnight, the Longhouse hummed with tense energy. Warriors paced like caged wolves. Knives flipped endlessly through calloused fingers. Someone, probably Ashka, had started a low, rhythmic growling that somehow harmonized with the wind. Thorgrim moved among them, stoking the flames of their wakefulness. "Remember," he told Gunnar, who was vibrating like a plucked bowstring, "this isn't fatigue. This is focus." "Feels like needing to piss," Gunnar muttered. "Channel it." As the night wore on, something strange happened. The usual irritations of sleeplessness, the dry eyes, the aching joints, the creeping sense of time moving like a wounded elk, transformed into something else entirely. The warrior's senses sharpened. The darkness seemed clearer, sounds more distinct. When Bjorn dropped a whetstone, half a dozen heads snapped toward the noise with predator precision. Even Hrold, normally the group's resident warrior, sat with unnerving stillness, his fingers tracing the edge of his axe with terrifying gentleness. "I think I understand berserkers now," he said quietly. "It's not about anger. It's about waiting." Dawn came gray and bloody, the sun rising like a fresh wound on the horizon. The warband assembled, their eyes bright with sleepless intensity. Where other men might have been sluggish, Thorgrim's warriors moved with eerie purpose. Every motion economical, every glance deliberate. Jarl Sigurd's forces, well-rested and complacent, never stood a chance. The battle was less a clash than a harvest. Thorgrim moved through the fray with glacial precision, his axe finding gaps in defenses before his opponents realized they'd left them open. Helga fought with chilling efficiency, her knives flickering like silver tongues. Even Hrold fought like a man possessed, his usual hesitation replaced by something far more dangerous: certainty. And Ashka? Asker finally stopped growling, only to start singing. It was, by all accounts, the world's worst battle hymn, an off-key ode to pickled herring and stab wounds, but it carried across the battlefield with terrifying clarity. By the third verse, Jarl Sigurd's men were actively fleeing from the sound. When the dust settled, Thorgrim surveyed the field. Their victory was absolute, their losses minimal. The warriors stood panting, their sleepless energy finally spent, their bodies catching up to the night's debt. Bjorn, leaning on his bloodied spear, grinned through split lips. "We should name this technique." Helga wiped her knives clean. "Insomnia's gift." Berserker's dawn rolled offered. Ulf spat out a piece of shield. "How about not sleeping and then killing everyone?" Thorgrim considered the suggestions as he cleaned his axe. In the end, the name didn't matter. What mattered was the result, and the knowledge that somewhere Freyja was probably laughing. That night, back in the longhouse, every warrior slept the sleep of the just, or at least the sleep of the utterly exhausted. All except Thorgrim. He lay awake, staring at the rafters, already planning their next campaign. Some habits, after all, were harder to break than others. Chapter 7. The Mead of Forgetfulness. The hangover arrived like a vengeful god, which Thorgrim reflected as he clutched his throbbing skull, was almost certainly someone's idea of divine punishment. The previous night's victory celebration had escalated in the traditional Viking manner. Mead had been consumed, boasts had been made, and at some point someone had attempted to ride a goat through the longhouse fire. The goat, for its part, seemed to be the only creature in the settlement not currently regretting its life choices. Thorgrim groaned and rolled onto his side, immediately regretting the movement as his stomach lurched in protest. Across the hall, Bjorn lay sprawled face down on a bench, one arm dangling limply toward the floor, his prized collection of runestones scattered around him like fallen comrades. Nearby, Hrold was curled in a ball, whispering what sounded like a heartfelt apology to his own liver. Only Helga appeared functional, though the murderous glint in her eye suggested this was less due to resilience, and more because she was already plotting revenge on whoever had convinced her that just one more horn of mead was a good idea. "Never again," Thorgrim muttered into his furs. This was, of course, A lie. There would absolutely be a next time. Mead was the Viking solution to everything. Celebrations, funerals, trade negotiations, and yes, insomnia. A generous enough pour could make even the longest night pass in a warm, golden blur. The only drawback was the morning after, when reality returned with the subtlety of an axe to the forehead. Bjorn groaned loudly and peeled his face off the bench. I think my skull is trying to escape. Let it, Helga growled. It would be an improvement. Thorgrim forced himself upright, swallowing back a wave of nausea. Whose idea was the goat? One. Then, from beneath a pile of furs, Adger's voice emerged, hoarse but unrepentant. Worth it. This was the cruel irony of Mead. In the moment, it was a miracle. The first sip burned away the day's aches. The second softened the edges of memory. And by the third, even the most hardened warrior might find himself waxing poetic about friendship or the beauty of well-balanced acts. Time became fluid, slipping past unnoticed until suddenly it was dawn, and the floor was inexplicably sticky, and someone had to explain to the goat why it was wearing Bjorn's hat. But the price was steep. Thorgrim staggered outside, blinking against the painfully bright sunlight. The settlement was a graveyard of regret. Warriors lay where they had fallen, some still clutching empty drinking horns like lifelines. One enterprising soul had apparently tried to sleep in the bread oven, though whether this was intentional or the result of poor navigation remained unclear. Gudrun, the only person in the village who could drink an entire longhouse under the table and still wake up chipper, was already bustling about, handing out cups of what she called morning medicine, a concoction that smelled like bog water and tasted like betrayal, but which did, admittedly, take the edge off the pounding in Thorgrim's skull. "Here," she said, thrusting a cup into his hands. "Drink up. It's mostly willow bark and fermented cabbage." Thorgrim eyed the murky liquid. "Mostly." Gudrun shrugged. "The rest is a mystery. That's what makes it work." He drank. It was every bit as foul as expected, but within minutes, the vise around his temples loosened slightly. Nearby, Bjorn was attempting to reassemble his runestones while muttering what sounded like an incantation against sunlight. "We should make rules," Rold moaned from his fetal position. Helga snorted. "Rules about mead. That's like rules about breathing." But Thorgrim considered it. Perhaps there was seen a middle ground, a way to harness Mead's sleep-inducing powers without inviting total annihilation the next day. The key, he suspected, lay in moderation, a concept as foreign to Vikings as passive aggression. Still, it was worth experimenting. That evening, as the longhouse recovered, Thorgrim convened a council. "From now on," he announced, "we ration." A chorus of groans answered him. "Not completely," he amended. "But we drink with purpose, mead for sleep, not for chaos." Bjorn, still looking slightly green, nodded. "A measured approach. Scientifically speaking, small, regular doses might maintain equilibrium without making us worship the latrine pit tomorrow," Helga finished bluntly. The plan was simple. Each warrior would be allotted a set amount based on their tolerance and, in Ager's case, their likelihood of attempting to ride livestock. The mead would be consumed slowly, deliberately, as part of a nightly ritual rather than a free-for-all. That night they put it to the test. The difference was immediate. Gone was the raucous shouting, the impromptu wrestling matches, the inevitable moment when someone tried to bite their own shield. Instead, the longhouse was filled with quiet murmurs, the occasional chuckle, the steady rhythm of whetstones on blades. Thorgrim sipped his portion slowly, savoring the warmth as it spread through his limbs. Beside him, Helga nursed her drink with uncharacteristic patience. Even Asker, under strict supervision, managed to keep his consumption to a dull roar. When the time came to sleep, the effect was undeniable. The mead's gentle embrace eased the sharp edges of wakefulness without obliterating consciousness entirely. Thorgrim lay down, his mind pleasantly adrift, his body heavy but not incapacitated. For the first time in recent memory, morning arrived without a battalion of regrets. No unexplained injuries. No missing livestock. No urgent need to apologize to inanimate objects. Bjorn, looking remarkably human, stretched and declared the experiment a success. "We've tamed the beast," he said proudly. Helga smirked. "Don't get cocky. We still have to survive tonight's test." Because tonight was the true challenge. A visit from Jarl Hakon's men. A group notorious for turning even the most civilized gathering into a mead-soaked brawl. If the new system could withstand Hintite, it could withstand anything. As the sun set, Thorgrim took stock of the longhouse. The mead was carefully measured, the warriors disciplined, the goat safely secured elsewhere. Somewhere in the distance a horn sounded. Their guests were approaching. Thorgrim took a deep breath and reached for his drinking horn. Time to see if moderation could survive a Viking party. Chapter 8. The Lullabies of Loki. The problem with moderation, Thorgrim soon discovered, was that it worked until it didn't. Jarl Hakon's men arrived like a storm front, their laughter booming, their mead horns already empty despite the journey. Within minutes, the carefully measured portions had been tossed aside in favor of a drinking contest that somehow involved both ale and raw onions. By midnight, the longhouse had descended into its usual chaos, which is precisely when the stories began. Not the noble sagas of Odin, nor the stirring tales of Thor's battles. No, these were the stories of Loki. It started innocently enough. One of Hakon's men, a grizzled warrior with a braided beard and eyes that glittered like wet stones, leaned forward and said, "Did I ever tell you about the time Loki convinced a giant to build Asgard's walls for free, then cheated him out of payment by turning into a mare?" A hush fell over the room. Even Aska paused mid-arm wrestle to listen. The storyteller continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And that's not the strangest part. When the mare, Loki, that is, gave birth 8 months later, Thorgrim could feel the collective shudder that ran through the room. That was the thing about Loki's tales. They dug under your skin like burrs, impossible to shake loose. Long after the mead had been drunk, and the fires burned low, the images lingered. Gods bound with their own sons' entrails, bets gone horribly right, pranks that spiraled into curses. By the time the visitors left the next morning, taking 3 of Thorgrim's best spoons and, inexplicably, 1 left boot, the damage was done. The entire village lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, minds racing with visions of Loki's exploit. Roald was the first to crack. "Do you think he's watching us right now?" he whispered into the darkness. "Who?" Thorgrim grunted. "Loki." A pause. Then from somewhere in the shadows, Bjorn's voice floated. "Statistically, no, but emotionally, absolutely." This was the curse of the trickster stories. They infected the mind like a fever. Every creak of the longhouse became Loki's footstep. Every gust of wind carried whispers of his laughter. Even the goats seemed suspiciously clever the next morning, their yellow eyes knowing as they chewed on Thorgrim's cloak. Helga, ever practical, took matters into her own hands. "We need counter-stories," she declared. "Tales so boring they'll put Loki himself to sleep." Bjorn brightened. "I could recite my treatise on North Sea herring migration patterns." "You'll do no such thing," Thorgrim said quickly. The solution, when it came, was unexpectedly simple. Gudrun, who remembered everything and forgot nothing, began telling the most mundane sagas imaginable, epic accounts of sheep farming techniques, riveting descriptions of butter churning, exhaustive genealogies of particularly unremarkable families. The effect was immediate. Within minutes, warriors were snoring open-mouthed on the benches, their dreams blissfully free of trickster gods. It worked perfectly until the night Loki himself apparently took offense. No one saw him, of course. But the next morning, every spoon in the village was bent at right angles. All the goats were wearing Bjorn's hats. How? And someone had replaced Thorgrim's whetstone with a very realistic-looking cheese. As the villagers surveyed the damage, Bjorn sighed. "I think we've been outmaneuvered." Thorgrim picked up the cheese whetstone and took a thoughtful bite. "Maybe," he said through a mouthful. "Or maybe this is exactly what he wanted. Because that was the truth of Loki. Just when you thought you'd outsmarted him, you realized you'd been playing his game all along." That night, Thorgrim lay awake listening to the wind. Somewhere in the darkness he could have sworn he heard laughter. He smiled despite himself and closed his eyes. Let the trickster come. He was ready. Chapter 9. The Longships Rocking. There were two types of Vikings in this world. Those who could sleep on a longship, and those who wanted to murder those who could. Thorgrim discovered this fundamental truth 3 days into their coastal raid, wedged between a snoring Bjorn and a barrel of pickled herring that seemed to be judging him. The ship rose and fell with the waves in a rhythm that should have been soothing. Instead, it felt like being rocked to sleep by a drunken giant. To make matters worse, Asker had begun sleep-talking in what sounded like a made-up language. At one point, he sat bolt upright, declared, "The fish are plotting," then immediately fell back asleep, leaving Thorgrim to stare nervously at the dark water beyond the rails. The only man seemingly unaffected was old Gunnar at the helm, who claimed he could sleep standing up like a horse. "The trick," he explained between yawns, "is to let your knees go loose, but keep your back straight. Also, don't fall overboard." This was easier said than done. The first night, Thorgrim had attempted to sleep propped against the mast, only to wake mid-fall toward the icy black waves. Only Roll's quick grab at his belt saved him from an impromptu baptism. By the 5th night, the crew had developed a system. Those who could sleep took the more stable spots near the center, while the rest took turns bailing, rowing, and glaring at their peacefully slumbering comrade. Helga, who could nap anywhere if sufficiently motivated, had somehow curled up inside the sail like some sort of deadly human barnacle. The real trouble began when the storm hit. One moment the sea was calm, the stars bright overhead. The next, the waves rose like angry gods, tossing the longship about like a toy. Rain fell in sheets, the wind howled, and somewhere in the chaos the pickled herring barrel broke free and began sliding back and forth across the deck with malicious intent. Bjorn, who had been in the middle of explaining his new theory about tidal patterns, suddenly found himself clinging to the rigging for dear life. "This is statistically unlikely weather," he shouted over the gale. Thorgrim, busy trying to keep both feet on deck and his stomach inside his body, didn't have the breath to reply. Next to him, Rold had turned an impressive shade of green and was making sounds that suggested his relationship with Mead would never be the same. Only Gunnar seemed unfazed, still at the helm though not thoroughly soaked. "Good sleeping weather," he bellowed cheerfully. It was then that Thorgrim noticed something remarkable. Between waves, in those brief moments when the ship steadied just before the next plunge, his exhaustion overtook him. His eyelids grew heavy, his grip slackened, and for a few precious seconds he would drift into something almost like sleep, only to be jerked awake by the next violent lurch. It was maddening. It was exhausting. It was, he realized with dawning horror, working. By the time the storm passed near dawn, the entire crew was in various states of disarray, drenched, bruised, and thoroughly worn out. Yet as the sun rose on calm waters, something miraculous happened. One by one the warriors slumped where they stood and slept like the dead. Even Rold, still faintly green, snored peacefully with his face pressed against a rowing bench. Thorgrim awoke hours later to find the ship drifting gently, the sail barely rippling in the breeze. Gunnar still stood at the helm, though now his chin rested on his chest, his hands loose on the tiller. The only sound was the quiet lapping of waves against the hull, and the occasional contented snore. Bjorn stood beside him, blinking blearily. "Did we die?" Thorgrim looked around at the scene of exhausted, sleeping warriors, the peacefully bobbing ship, the now benign sea. "If this is Valhalla," he murmured, "it's disappointingly calm." But there was wisdom here, he realized. The sea gave no easy rest, but it gave what was needed. The constant motion that seemed so disruptive at first had, in its own way, worn them down until sleep became inevitable. That evening, as the crew prepared for another night at sea, Thorgrim took his place near the mast with newfound appreciation. The gentle rocking of the ship, once his enemy, now seemed almost companionable. Somewhere amidships, Asger began another round of sleep-talking. "The fish have unions now," he mumbled. Thorgrim closed his eyes and let the waves carry him away. Chapter 10. Odin's one-eyed Vigil. The fire had burned low in the longhouse, leaving the air thick with smoke and the scent of damp wool. Outside, a winter gale howled like a scorned spirit, rattling the shutters with icy fingers. Thorgrim lay awake yet again, staring at the ceiling beams where shadows danced in the dim emberlight. This time it wasn't the cold or the snoring or even Loki's mischief keeping him from sleep. It was thoughts, endless, circling thoughts about crop rotations, shield wall formations, and whether Bjorn had been right about that damned tidal theory. "You look like you're trying to solve the universe," Helga muttered from beside him, her voice rough with sleep. Thorgrim rubbed his good eye. The other still ached sometimes from that ill-considered axe demonstration last summer. "Do you ever wonder if the Allfather sleeps?" Helga blinked at him. "What?" "Odin," Thorgrim said, "gave up an eye for wisdom, hung 9 nights on Yggdrasil for knowledge. That's the sort of thing that changes a man. Or a god." Across the hall, Bjorn's head popped up from his furs like a gopher scenting rain. "Are we having a theological discussion? Because I have notes." And so, in the dead of another endless northern night, the unlikely philosophers of the Longhouse found themselves contemplating the insomnia of gods. Bjorn, of course, had theories. "Consider the burdens of omniscience," he said, tapping his temple. "Knowing all things means seeing all possible outcomes simultaneously. The weight of infinite possibilities would keep anyone awake." Helga rolled her eyes. Or maybe his eye socket itches. But Thorgrim couldn't shake the image. The Allfather in his high seat, ravens whispering secrets in his ears, his single eye staring endlessly into the well of wisdom while the other socket ached with phantom pain. What good was knowing the secrets of the runes if you couldn't close your eyes against them? The next night, during his usual axe-sharpening ritual, Thorgrim experimented. He closed his left eye, leaving only the right to focus on the whetstone's path along the blade. At first it was merely awkward. His depth perception faltered, and he nearly nicked his thumb twice. But as the rhythm took hold, something strange happened. With half his vision gone, his mind seemed to focus with unnatural intensity. The scratches on the blade stood out like runes. The sound of steel on stone became a language. For one dizzying moment he understood the secret name of his axe, the true nature of the iron, the Thorgrim. Bjorn's voice snapped him back. "You've been sharpening the same spot for 10 minutes. You're going to wear a hole in it." Thorgrim blinked, his vision swimming back to normalcy. He realized his hands were shaking. That's when the idea took root. What if Odin's sleeplessness wasn't just the price of wisdom, but its ongoing method? The missing eye wasn't simply a sacrifice made. It was a perpetual state of being, a wound that never fully closed, keeping the Allfather forever balanced between wakefulness and vision. The others noticed his distraction in the days that followed. Even Asger commented as Thorgrim stared too long at the soup kettle one evening. "Did you lose something in there?" "Because I already checked." But Thorgrim was beginning to understand something fundamental. His own sleepless nights, the constant churn of thoughts, the way problems unraveled themselves in the dark hours. This wasn't merely an affliction. It was a kind of sight. On the 8th night of his contemplation, the storm finally broke. The skies cleared, and through the smoke hole in the longhouse roof, Thorgrim could see the stars, including the one the elders called Odin's Eye, gleaming cold and constant in the northern sky. He lay back on his furs, keeping both eyes open, letting the celestial gaze meet his own. The thoughts still churned. The problems remained unsolved, but something had shifted. Helga elbowed him in the ribs. Going to stare at the sky all night? Thorgrim smiled in the darkness. Maybe. Because sometimes the price of seeing clearly was learning to live with the dark. And if the Allfather could endure an eternity of watchful nights, surely one Viking could manage until dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. Thorgrim closed his eyes at last, and for the first time in many nights, slept without dreaming. Chapter 11. The Curse of the Unburied. The dead man in the bog was not staying dead. Thorgrim knew this because for 3 nights running, the entire village had been woken by the unmistakable sound of wet footsteps, squelching past the longhouse, accompanied by the faint smell of peat and something older. Something that reeked of secrets best left buried. Bjorn, who had been peacefully dreaming about tax reforms, sat bolt upright on the 4th night when the squelching stopped directly outside his window. "That's it," he declared, his scholarly composure fraying at the edges. "We're either dealing with a very lost traveler or a draugr with terrible timing." The village had found the bogman a week earlier while digging peat, a warrior from generations past, preserved by the tannins, his leathery skin still clinging to his bones, his empty eye socket somehow managing to glare. They'd done the decent thing, left him where he lay, piled stones around the spot, and made offerings to Hel, goddess of the dead. Apparently she hadn't been listening. Roaut, who had been sleeping with his axe clutched to his chest like a child's doll, whimpered. Maybe he's just stretching his legs. Aska, ever practical, hefted his own weapon. Dead men don't need exercise. The problem with restless spirits, Thorgrim reflected as he pulled on his boots, was that they lacked consideration for the living. Every Viking knew the rules. A proper burial, the right offerings, a stern warning to stay in one's grave. But this one had clearly missed the memo. They found him standing knee-deep in the bog, his skeletal fingers flexing as if remembering the weight of a sword. The moonlight made his leathery skin gleam like old bronze, and when he turned his head toward them, the hollows of his eyes seemed to swallow the night itself. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Bjorn, brave, foolish Bjorn, cleared his throat. "Ah, good evening. You're, up late." The draugr tilted its head, the movement accompanied by a sound like wet rope straining. Helga stepped forward, her knife already in hand. "Listen, corpse, we've got a raid coming up and need our sleep. Either go back to your bog or I'll put you back." The draugr made a noise that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like a drowning man's last gasp. Then it spoke, its voice bubbling up from lungs still full of peat water. "No ship." Thorgrim frowned. "What?" The draugr eased one skeletal arm, pointing north toward the coast. "No ship, no rest." Realization dawned. The bogman wasn't walking because he wanted to haunt them. He was walking because his burial was unfinished. Ancient law was clear on this point. A warrior without his ship would wander forever, unable to reach the afterlife. This one had been buried in a bog, not burned with his vessel as tradition demanded. No wonder he was cranky. Thorgrim sighed and rubbed his temples. "All right, tomorrow we build a ship." Roaut made a strangled noise. "We're giving him a funeral? Now? Unless you want to keep listening to squelching all winter, yes." The next day, the village worked in exhausted silence, hewing pine logs into the rough shape of a small carving. It wasn't pretty. Azur's attempt at a dragon's head looked more like a confused weasel, but it would burn. As the sun set, they hauled the boat to the bog's edge, placed the draugr inside with what remained of his weapons, and set it alight. The flames caught quickly, reflected in the dark water like some spectral armada. The Draugr sat upright in the prow as the fire consumed him, his posture straightening for the first time in centuries. Just before the flames reached his face, he turned his head toward Thorgrim and nodded once. That night, the longhouse was blissfully quiet. No footsteps, no squelching. Just the peaceful snores of warriors finally getting some rest. At dawn, Bjorn found Thorgrim staring at the charred remains of the ship, now half sunk in the bog. "Problem solved?" Thorgrim shrugged. "For now. But mark my words, somewhere out there's a Draugr missing his oar. And when he comes knocking, I'm making Roll deal with it." Somewhere in the distance, a raven called, whether in agreement or mockery, it was hard to say. But for the first time in weeks, the village slept soundly, undisturbed, except for Azur's usual sleep muttering about the weasel-proud menace he'd created. And if the occasional bog bubble popped louder than usual, well, some things were best ignored. Chapter 12. The Runes of Restlessness. Bjorn had been studying the runestones all morning, with the intensity of a man trying to decipher why his mead tasted suspiciously like pickling brine. He finally looked up, his scholarly beard quivering with excitement. "I found it. The perfect combination of runes for restful sleep." Thorgrim squinted at the weathered stone Bjorn was enthusiastically pointing at. "That looks like someone sneezed on a rock." "Ah, but look closer." Bjorn traced the carvings with a grimy finger. "This sequence here, Laguz for water's calm, Berkana for new beginnings and, most importantly, Dagaz for the peaceful transition between day and night. Carve these above your bed, and sleep will come like a gentle tide." Helga, who had been sharpening her knives with increasing skepticism, snorted. "Last time you deciphered runes, we ended up with a chicken that laid square eggs." "That," Bjorn said haughtily, "was an unrelated coincidence." Despite the skepticism, Thorgrim was desperate enough to try anything. The Draugr's haunting had left the entire village jumpy, and even now, weeks later, every creak of the longhouse had warriors reaching for their axes. If a few carved symbols could help, why not? That evening, with great ceremony, and considerably more mead than was strictly necessary for wood carving, Thorgrim etched the runes into the beam above his sleeping area. The cuts were rough, more like axe wounds than sacred symbols, but Bjorn assured him the magic was in the intent, not the craftsmanship. "Now," Bjorn announced, swaying slightly, "we wait for the cosmic energies to align with." A deafening crack cut him off as the beam split clean in two, dropping several pounds of wood directly onto Thorgrim's head. When the stars cleared from his vision, Thorgrim glared up at the now ruined runes. "You call this cosmic energy?" Bjorn blinked. Perhaps I misread the Dagaz rune. That might have been Thurisaz, the giant's thorn rune, known for its abruptness." Helga rolled her eyes so hard it was audible. "Wonderful. Instead of sleep runes, we've got splinter runes." The next morning they discovered the first side effect. Every piece of wood in the longhouse had developed an unnerving tendency to snap at inopportune moments. Benches collapsed under seated warriors. Bowls cracked mid-soup, and poor Hrold's favorite spoon simply exploded in his hand during breakfast. "The runes are too powerful," Bjorn whispered, eyeing the wreckage of what had been a perfectly good butter churn. "We must undo them." This proved more difficult than expected. Runes once carved were stubborn things, like house guests who overstay their welcome, but also rearrange your furniture. Thorgrim tried scraping them out, only for the symbols to reappear by morning, now slightly glowing. Helga suggested burning the entire beam, but Gudrun pointed out this might result in fire runes, which sounded problematic. Their solution came from an unexpected source. Asga, who had been quietly observing the chaos while chewing on what appeared to be a door hinge. "Why not carve more runes?" he said around a mouthful of metal. "Opposite her once, Bjorn's eyes lit up. Of course, we'll use Isa, the ice rune, to freeze the first rune's effects, and Sawilo, the sun rune, to provide counterbalance. This time, they approached the carving with considerably less mead and considerably more caution. Thorgrim made the new runes deep and clear, his knife moving with precision. As the last stroke was completed, a visible shiver ran through the wood, and the original runes faded to mere shadows in the grain. For a moment, all was still. Then the snoring started. Not ordinary snoring. This was a sound like a bear choking on a beehive, deep and resonant enough to vibrate the very foundations of the longhouse. Warriors yacked awake, clutching their ears. Somewhere outside, a dog began howling in harmony. Bjorn's face drained of color. Oh dear, I may have reversed the intended effect. Thorgrim, his eye twitching, grabbed the scholar by his tunic. Fix it. Now. After much frantic consultation of scrolls and several near misses, with collapsing furniture, they finally carved the correct combination. Othala for heritage and home, paired with Gibo for gifts and partnerships. The dreadful snoring ceased immediately, replaced by a peaceful silence so profound it was almost unsettling. That night, for the first time in memory, the entire longhouse slept soundly. Even Asger, who usually mumbled battle plans in his sleep, lay still as a stone. The only disturbance came from Bjorn, who awoke briefly to scribble notes about runic resonance frequencies before falling back asleep mid-sentence, quill still in hand. At dawn, Thorgrim rose, feeling more rested than he had in years. The runes above his bed pulsed faintly with a warm golden light, their power now properly balanced. Even Helga, usually the last to admit when Bjorn was right about anything, grudgingly acknowledged the improvement. There's just one problem, Hrold said as they broke their fast. He pointed to the rafters where dozens of ravens had gathered, apparently drawn by the runic energies. The birds watched them with unnerving intelligence, occasionally tilting their heads in perfect synchronization. Bjorn coughed. Ah, yes. That might be the Perthro rune's doing. It does tend to attract Odin's attention. Thorgrim sighed and reached for the mead. It was going to be a long day. But at least he reflected as he watched a raven steal Asger's breakfast right off his plate. They'd solved the sleeplessness. And if the price was a few extra divine observers? Well, that was a problem for tomorrow's runes. Chapter 13. The Snoring Hall. The miracle of the runes lasted exactly 3 nights. On the 4th evening, as the longhouse settled into what should have been peaceful slumber, a new sound emerged, a noise so profound it seemed to vibrate the very bones of the earth. It began as a low rumble, built to a whistling crescendo, then collapsed into a wet, gurgling gasp before starting the cycle anew. Thorgrim sat bolt upright, his hand already on his axe. Is that Gunnar? Helga confirmed wearily from beside him. His nose healed. Old Gunnar's legendary snoring had been absent since his unfortunate encounter with an angry goose during the autumn migration. But now, with his deviated septum miraculously straightened by Gudrun's questionable bone adjustment techniques involving 2 fingers and a sudden sharp twist, the full force of his nasal passages had been unleashed upon the world once more. Across the hall, Bjorn was already scribbling notes by candlelight. Fascinating. The amplitude suggests a resonance frequency capable of shaking loose mortar. As if to prove his point, a clump of thatch detached itself from the ceiling and landed squarely in Hrold's open mouth. The longhouse descended into chaos. Aska began banging his shield against the wall in rhythm with Gunnar's snores, creating a bizarre call and response that only amplified the noise. 2 young warriors started a betting pool on how long until the next gurgling gasp. Someone threw a boot. Thorgrim watched as Helga methodically wrapped strips of wool around her head, covering first her ears, then her eyes, then, when the snoring hit a particularly shrill note, her nose as well. She resembled nothing so much as a very angry mummy. "We have to do something," Rold pleaded, spitting out thatch. The solutions came fast and varied. Gudrun suggested stuffing Gunnar's nostrils with beeswax, an idea abandoned when the old warrior's sleep battered her away with frightening accuracy. Bjorn proposed a complex system of hanging blankets to baffle the sound waves, which worked until Azur rolled over and brought the entire arrangement down like a drunk spider's web. It was young Olaf who made the critical observation. "You know," he yawned, "it kind of sounds like the war horns at Kalfsfjord." A hush fell over the group. Thorgrim tilted his head, listening as Gunnar's current snore built to a triumphant blare. The boy was right. There was a certain martial quality to the noise, a rhythm not unlike the call and response of battle chants. An idea took shape. The next night, when Gunnar's nostrils first began their nightly symphony, the entire longhouse joined in. Warriors timed their breathing to the snores, creating a deep, rumbling chorus. Shield maidens added high-pitched whistles on the crescendos. Bjorn, displaying surprising lung capacity, provided bass notes by humming through a hollow log. What emerged was nothing short of miraculous. A thunderous, rolling harmony that shook the rafters but somehow, paradoxically, created a rhythm so steady it became soothing. The vibrations traveled up through the sleeping benches, massaging tired backs. The predictable cycles regulated breathing. Even the ravens in the rafters tucked their heads under wings, lulled by the strange music. By week's end, no one could sleep without it. Visiting warriors complained of the noise, only to find themselves dozing off mid-protest. Children began imitating the cadence during play. The village dogs, initially howling along, now gathered outside the longhouse each night like furry concert-goers. Gunnar, once an outcast for his nighttime noises, became something of a celebrity. Woman braided his beard extra tight for better acoustics. The blacksmith fashioned him a nose guard that enhanced the timbre. Bjorn wrote an entire saga about the song of Gunnar's nostrils, though mercifully lost it in a Mead-related incident. The final test came when Jarl Eagle's envoy visited to discuss trade agreements. The man, a notorious light sleeper, arrived expecting a miserable night. Instead, he slept so deeply that he missed breakfast entirely and woke declaring it the most refreshing rest he'd had since childhood. "You must send Gunnar to my lord's hall," the envoy insisted as he departed. "The Jarl hasn't slept properly since the Yule raid of 63. Thorgrim watched the man ride away, then turned to survey his unexpectedly peaceful village. Children napped in sunbeams. Warriors dozed at their posts. Even Helga had taken to napping between meals, a development that boded well for everyone's continued survival. The solution had been there all along, not in fighting the noise, but in embracing it. A lesson, Thorgrim reflected, that applied to more than just snoring. Somewhere overhead, a raven chuckled. Gunnar, awake for once, belched contentedly. And for the first time in living memory, the Viking village knew peace. At least until the next crisis, but that was a problem for tomorrow's sleepless night. Chapter 14. The Midnight Raid on Sleep. The moon hung like a pale shield above the fjord when Thorgrim's raiding party slipped their longships onto the pebbled shore. Not a single man among them yawned. This was no accident. "Remember the plan," Thorgrim whispered as they crept through the bracken. "We strike between third and fourth watch, when their sentries are nodding off and—" "Wait," young Olaf interrupted, his brow furrowed. "Other people actually sleep at night." A stunned silence fell over the raiding party. 12 bearded faces turned toward Thorgrim with identical expressions of revelation. Helga was the first to articulate it. "We've been thinking about this all wrong. Midnight raids aren't strategy. They're necessity." The implications were staggering. While other cultures stumbled bleary-eyed through pre-dawn attacks, Viking raiders had spent generations wide awake anyway, sharp-eyed, clear-headed, and already grumpy from lack of sleep. Their legendary nighttime ferocity wasn't just tactics, it was insomnia with an axe. The coastal village ahead lay quiet, its thatched roof silvered by moonlight. One sentry slumped against a post, his chin on his chest. Another leaned on his spear, blinking like a man trying to remember his own name. Thorgrim's band moved like shadows between the huts. They'd all perfected the art of silent movement during countless sleepless nights, avoiding creaky floorboards in their own longhouses. Now, the skill paid off in stolen livestock and unopposed looting. It wasn't until they reached the chieftain's hall that things went awry. The door burst open before they could touch it, revealing a wild-eyed man clutching a tankard. "Thank the gods," he exclaimed. "I haven't slept in 3 days." Thorgrim lowered his axe. "What?" "Ever since that cursed Draugr started walking the shoreline," the chieftain continued, "no one in this village has gotten proper rest. We've tried warm milk, sheep counting, even that southern trick with lavender. Nothing works." He peered at Thorgrim's alert warriors with something like awe. "However do you people manage?" Behind Thorgrim, Bjorn began taking notes. Asger puffed out his chest. Roert looked disturbingly smug. An idea took shape, one so audacious it might have been Loki's own mischief. Thorgrim cleared his throat. "For the right price, we could solve your sleeping problem." Thus began the Vikings' most unexpected enterprise, Insomnia relief raids. Their methods were unorthodox but effective. For villages plagued by restless spirits, they staged elaborate exorcisms involving loud singing and strategic axe work. For those kept awake by neighbor disputes, they offered neutral arbitration, which mostly consisted of glaring at both parties until exhaustion made them compliant. And for one particularly desperate fishing hamlet, they simply sat watch all night while the villagers slept, repaying their hospitality by slaughtering any nightmares that dared appear. Word spread. Soon, coastal settlements began leaving out offerings not to ward off Vikings, but to request their services. A basket of eggs might buy a week's peaceful sleep. A barrel of good mead could secure protection from night terrors until the next full moon. "We've become night nurses," Helga grumbled as they hauled another grateful village's tribute to their ships. Bjorn adjusted his spectacles. "Technically, we're somnological security consultants." Whatever the title, the results spoke for themselves. The raids continued, not for plunder, but for pillows. Not for gold, but for gratitude. And if the occasional chicken coop still found itself mysteriously lighter come morning, well, old habits died hard. On calm nights, when the northern lights danced overhead, Thorgrim would sometimes stand watch alone, listening to the peaceful snores coming from both his ship and the villages they protected. It was, he reflected, a strange turn for a band of warriors once feared for their midnight violence. But then again, nothing made a man more vicious than lack of sleep, and nothing made him more generous than finally getting some. Somewhere in the darkness, a raven chuckled. Thorgrim smiled and leaned against the ship's rail, wide awake and perfectly content. The night stretched before him, full of possibilities. And somewhere down the coast, another sleepless village waited. Chapter 15. The Saga of the Sleepless Skald. The stranger arrived during the first winter storm, his cloak crusted with ice, his beard frozen into a single stiff braid. He introduced himself as Egil the Verbose, Skald to forgotten kings and chronicler of unsung battles. His eyes gleamed with the particular madness of a man who had spent too many nights wrestling words into meter. "I seek shelter," he announced, "and an audience for my latest Saga and you." Thorgrim, who had learned caution after the rune incident, eyed the man warily. "How long is this saga?" Egil smiled, revealing teeth, filed into perfect poetic meters. "Only 742 verses, with refrains." That should have been the first warning. The second came when Eagle began composing aloud while waiting for stew. His verses about the boiling bubbles were hauntingly beautiful. His description of the carrot's tragic demise brought tears to Gudrun's eyes, and by the time he reached the ode to the ladle, even Helga looked ready to drown herself in the broth. But the true horror began at bedtime. As the long house settled in for the night, Eagle cleared his throat. To honor your hospitality, I shall recite my masterwork. Mead, the lay of endless wakefulness, a saga in 12 parts about the timeless struggle between man and... No, Thorgrim said. It was already too late. Egil's voice rolled through the longhouse like a tidal wave of syllables, each alliteration crashing against the next, every kenning more elaborate than the last. He described insomnia with such vivid imagery that listeners could feel their own eyelids growing heavy, not with sleep, but with existential dread. Warriors tossed and turned as the verses burrowed into their brains like earworms with battle axes. Clo, the cruel moon doth mock my rest, Egil intoned, like Loki's laughter in my breast. Aska sat up abruptly. I'll give you Loki's laughter. Thorgrim intervened before bloodshed could occur. Perhaps save the rest for daylight. Egil looked wounded. But the meter works better by moonlight. By dawn, the Skald had reached only verse 203. The villagers stumbled through their chores like walking dead, flinching at every rhyme. Young Olaf was found trying to drown himself in the milk pail. Even the goats seemed depressed. Desperate measures were required. Bjorn proposed a scientific approach. If we calculate the exact frequency of his droning, we could create a countersound, shunned. Helga shows a simpler solution, pressing a whetstone to the Skald's throat. Next verse is your last. But Thorgrim had a more cunning plan. That evening, as Egil cleared his throat to resume his epic, Thorgrim began his own story. A rambling, monotonous tale about watching moss grow on a north-facing rock. Bjorn joined in with a detailed analysis of sheep digestion patterns. Soon, the entire household was contributing increasingly dull anecdotes, creating a cacophony of boredom so profound it made Egil's eyes glaze over. The Skald lasted 17 minutes before his head hit the table with a thunk. Silence fell. Then, slowly, the villagers crept to their beds, afraid to make a sound lest they waked the poetic beast. In the morning, they found Egil already composing again. That was marvelous, he exclaimed. You've inspired an entirely new saga, Faun of Supreme Tedium, in 34 parts with... Thorgrim made a decision. He pressed a bag of silver into the Skald's hands, along with directions to Jarl Sigurd's hall. Tell him Thorgrim sent you. He loves poetry. As Egil disappeared into the snow, already composing verses about his frost-bitten toes, the villagers collapsed in exhausted relief. The goats stopped weeping. The milk pail was safe once more. But the damage lingered. For weeks after, villagers would wake screaming from dreams of iambic pentameter. Children spoke in unnatural rhymes, and somewhere in the distance, they could swear they heard the faint, haunting strains of an epic saga about insomnia, growing closer. Chapter 16. The Whale's Lament. The first time Thorgrim heard the singing, he assumed it was Hrold, drowning his sorrows again. The sound drifted across the moonlit bay, a deep, mournful wail that rose and fell like the tide itself. It was the kind of noise that seeped into your bones and made your teeth ache. By the third night, the entire village was awake. "It's the whales," insisted old Arnkell, who had once survived a capsized whaling boat by clinging to a dead seal. "They're mourning their fallen. I've heard it before. Sounds like a widow's lament, if the widow weighed 8 tons and had bad breath." Bjorn, who had been attempting to transcribe the sounds into runic notation, frowned. Fascinating. But why would they only sing at night? "Because," Arnkell said darkly, "that's when ghosts swim." This explanation satisfied exactly no one, yet somehow became accepted truth. Soon the villagers were making offerings to Njord, god of the sea, tossing entire casks of good mead into the waves in hopes of quieting the whale's grief. The singing only grew louder. Thorgrim took matters into his own hands. Assembling a crew of the most sleep-deprived warriors, which, at this point, was everyone, he set out in a longship to confront the musical leviathans. What they found was not a grieving pod of whales. It was Ashgar. The big warrior sat alone on a rocky outcrop, knee-deep in the surf, singing what sounded like a love ballad to an empty mead horn. His voice, if it could be called that, wobbled between octaves like a mortally wounded seal. Every third note was punctuated by a wet hiccup. "You," Thorgrim bellowed from the ship. Aska turned, his face splitting into a grin. "Thragim," just in time for chorus. The truth tumbled out between slurred verses. Aska had been secretly improving his mead ration with a personal stash of fermented cloudberries. The combination, while potent, left him prone to midnight serenades. The bay's peculiar acoustics had done the rest, amplifying his drunken warbling into something resembling aquatic grief. Helga massaged her temples. "We sacrificed 12 casks of good mead because you can't hold your berries." Aska begged, in what might have been an apology or punctuation. The solution was simple. Confiscate the cloudberry stash, assign a rotating guard to watch Azure at night, and quietly retrieve the sacrificial mead casks before they soaked through entirely. By week's end, the whale songs had ceased, though several villagers reported strange cravings for fermented fruit. Yet the legend persisted. Visitors to the village would ask about the legendary singing whales, and no one had the heart to correct them. Uncle even began selling whale-repelling charms, small carved stones that suspiciously resembled corked bottles. As for Adger, he took his newfound musical fame in stride, though he was strictly limited to singing during daylight hours. His rendition of "ID Lay of the Herring" at the next feast brought tears to many eyes, though whether from emotion or pain was difficult to say. And if sometimes, on particularly still nights, a faint wailing could still be heard from the direction of the bay, well, some mysteries were better left unsolved. The villagers slept soundly once more, their dreams mercifully free of musical marine life, until the night the Yairil whales began singing. But that, as Bjorn would say, was a statistically unlikely coincidence best examined in daylight, preferably with a large horn of unfermented mead. Chapter 17. The Final Rest, or Lack thereof. The pyre burned bright against the starless sky, its flames licking at the belly of Thorgrim's longship as it drifted further from shore. His body lay wrapped in furs, his favorite axe clasped in his hands, his face finally merciful, at peace. Helga watched from the black sand beach, arms crossed, jaw set. Beside her, Bjorn rubbed his temples, already composing the saga in his head. Aska, uncharacteristically silent, clutched a horn of mead that he had yet to drink from. "The flames should keep him warm," Gudrun muttered. "They'd better," Helga replied. "If he comes back complaining about the cold, I'm stuffing him in a bog myself." It was a good send-off, as these things went. The ship was sturdy, the fire well built, the offerings plentiful. There had been the usual arguments whether to include Thorgrim's whetstone. Yes, whether to include Hrol's terrible poetry. No, whether Aegir should be allowed to sing. Absolutely not. But now, as the burning ship slipped into the horizon, something unexpected happened. The fire flickered. Not the natural wind-tossed flicker of a funeral pyre, but a deliberate pulse, once, twice, 3 times, as if signaling. Then, as the entire village watched, the flames roared brighter, twisting into the unmistakable shape of a raised fist before dissipating into the night. A long silence followed. "Well," Bjorn said at last, scribbling furiously. "That's new." Helga sighed and turned toward the longhouse. Of course, he wouldn't even stay dead properly. In the days that followed, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. A freshly sharpened axe found where no axe had been left. A half-empty mead horn discovered on the high seat, still cool to the touch. The occasional raven perched on the roof, watching with far too knowing an eye. And the dreams. Not the usual dreams, vague, fleeting things, but vivid, unmistakable visions. Thorgrim, standing at the prow of a ghostly longship, grinning as he sailed through storm and starlight, his laughter echoing across the waves. Thorgrim, trading insults with long-dead warriors in Valhalla's mead hall. Thorgrim, appearing at the foot of Bjorn's bed to argue about tide theories. At first, the villagers tried ritual solutions, more offerings, more prayers, a particularly sternly worded runestone warning against post-mortem mischief. None of it worked. Eventually, they simply accepted it. Some spirits were too restless for even death to slow them down. And if, on particularly quiet nights, the wind carried the faint sound of an axe being sharpened, or if the fire spat sparks in a familiar rhythm, no one mentioned it. After all, as Bjorn noted in his final treatise on the subject, true Vikings never really slept. They just waited for the next adventure. And somewhere beyond the waves, beneath the endless northern sky, the fire still burned, the story still spun, and the night stretched on, restless as ever.